Corruption, ethics and why none of us seem to trust our politicians. It's great to see you. Welcome to Q&A. I'm with Alan Morell, who's got our first question tonight. Here to answer your questions, lawyer and Bandjalung woman Dani Larkin. Liberal member for Wentworth, Dave Sharma. Former Treasury Secretary, Ken Henry. The Shadow Minister for Education, Tanya Plibersek. And Simon Longstaff from the Ethics Centre. Please make all of them feel welcome. All right, Alan, what's your question?
My question, once upon a time, members of Parliament were stood down for misleading Parliament. Now, obfuscation, refusal to answer questions, secrecy and outright lies are commonplace and go unpunished. Grants and funding are given in a partisan manner, without tender, without a paper trail, and in some cases without even being applied for. Rudeness, lack of respect and petulant behaviour has become the norm from the government, particularly during question time, and misleading advertising, deception and outright lies dominate pre-election claims and advertising. Why don't we make truth and transparency mandatory to guarantee the integrity and reputation of our politicians?
Simon Longstaff.
Wow. Well, I think we should, because I think when politicians lie to the public, it undermines the quality of the consent that we give. You cannot give informed consent if what has been proposed to you is untrue.
Exactly.
And that's just part of the litany of things that you referred to, where I think what we have to be concerned about is ensuring that those who exercise public power do so exclusively in the public interest. And I think what's been really upsetting a lot of Australians is that that's not been happening. Too often they've seen it being a partial exercise of power for private interests, private political interests. But I think the deepest thing of all, which has troubled people, is that they feel that in every aspect of their lives, they're held accountable, even for the slightest error that they might make. Whereas those people who have those considerable privileges of elected office, in particular, but not just them, seem never to be truly accountable for the things that they do.
Dave Sharma.
Well, look, a question like Alan's is a sad one to hear, I guess, as a politician. But I know where it's coming from. I've heard it from voters myself. I would say this though. I think, look, I'm quite new to Parliament and quite new to politics, and most of the people I know in this building, on all sides of the building, across the aisles, are here for the right reasons and to do a good job. But government is difficult and politics is difficult. It's really about the trade-off between competing priorities and trying to, settle competing interests often enough. And fundamental truth, you're not going to keep all of the people happy all of the time. But I would say that I've been pretty impressed with how the Australian system has performed through COVID-19. This has been a stress test for a large number of countries, and you'd have to say Australian institutions, and that doesn't just mean the federal parliament, the federal government. It means chief health officers, it means epidemiologists, it means frontline health workers, it means police and law enforcement. They've all held up really well. I think we should be proud of the job they've done. Doesn't mean we shouldn't be seeking to improve our system and the integrity of our system, but I don't think we should be too despondent about the sort of position we're in.
Alan, he's right, isn't he? When it came to the pressure test of this critical moment, we could trust the bulk of our politicians, couldn't we?
As far as COVID goes, we've handled it incredibly well compared to the rest of the world, but now we're using COVID as a convenient excuse for not having a National Integrity Commission. We can't possibly chew gum and walk at the same time, but it doesn't stop the government from introducing legislation that they are politically tied to, like making university fees more expensive. Why is a National Integrity Commission that people want, that would keep the government honest, so difficult, but other legislation is not?
Tanya Plibersek, let me put that to you. Obviously, a National Integrity Commission has been promised. Clearly, it hasn't been anywhere near delivered.
No, it's very disappointing. I think you could fairly say there's a 3-year delay on this since the government promised it. I think it's very important that we have a National Integrity Commission and a strong one, not a toothless tiger, but also that we support the other organisations that hold public figures like me to account, the Australian National Audit Office, a free and diverse media. That means proper funding for the ABC, and it means media diversity. We need all of that. But underneath those mechanisms, rules and laws, we also need to attract and keep people in public life who genuinely want to do the right thing for their community, not just enrich themselves. I really like Anthony Trollope and his novels. He wrote a series of novels called the Palliser series, and he had this fictional English Prime Minister who said to his son one day, "Son, if the best you can do is when you're defending yourself, is the best you can do is what I did was not illegal. You have so missed the point of what is expected of someone in your position." And I think that's really important too. We absolutely need a tough cop on the beat. We absolutely need to properly fund and resource and give power to these organisations. But we also need a bedrock of ethics and behaviour in our public life that means that we're not relying on being caught out by the rules or the police when we're doing the wrong thing, but that we just don't do the wrong thing in the first place. Like, it's not rocket science.
Dave Sharma, I just want to be clear about this. Do you think we should have a National Integrity Commission?
Absolutely. I mean, we're committed to doing it, and we will deliver one.
So why don't we have one yet? Why can't we even see the legislation that you are going to put forward? Because it was promised at the end of last year, at the start of this year. Just unclear as to why we can't see it.
Well, we put out a discussion paper in December of 2018. We took submissions in response to that discussion paper. Draft legislation's been prepared and it will be released in a matter of weeks, and then we'll have consultation around it.
Well, it was ready in December.
This is going to happen.
It was ready in December. We know it was ready in December. So using COVID as an excuse, as the Prime Minister has done, just doesn't cut it. It's just, like, release the legislation. We don't even have to debate it in Parliament today. We can still have people looking at it, considering it, debating it in the public, determining whether this is strong enough. What really worries me is we'll look at the legislation and it won't be anywhere near strong enough.
There was a bill introduced today, I think, by Dr Helen Haynes, the independent member for Indi, and that's based, as I understand it, on the Beechworth principles, which would give comprehensive coverage and it has real teeth. What I'm interested in is whether or not the major parties will at least allow it to be debated. I'm not sure whether they'll vote for it, but will it be debated?
Well, I hope so. I haven't seen the legislation, but I have spoken to Helen Haynes about her bill, and I think it's great that she has joined this fight. But of course we need to look at the legislation in some detail. I think it's terrific that she's involved, but surely to God, this would pass more quickly and be more effective if we had government legislation providing a strong National Integrity Commission.
Dani, do you think there is a different set of standards for our politicians compared with the rest of us?
100%. I mean, our representative democracy, is supposed to promise us in a perfect world accountability, ethical decision-making and ethical decision-making that's transparent. But what we see is, things are clouded in secrecy and things are hidden. And that gives us no reassurance, as a collective, as people that, vote in people to represent our best interests. It gives us no assurance that that's in fact what they're doing. And as Simon said, most of the decisions that we're seeing playing out now, they're self-serving for either the individual politician's interest or their political party. And what's infuriating, though, from a First Nation perspective is all of this, when we talk about ethics within institutions, negates taking into account First Nation perspectives. All of this, for me, it tells me that what we're calling for really here is substantive structural reform within Australia. What we need and what we're looking for is a real contest of ideas, of political debate being had from across all sides of politics. And the debates are talking about topics about empowering all Australians, including those that are of Indigenous descent, and talking about, mechanisms like an constitutionally entrenched voice to Parliament that would also work as an accountability mechanism that would in particular represent First Nation interests, because I can tell you now, I've had a look at the New South Wales ICAC, and what it doesn't prioritise, because it's predominantly comprised of non-Indigenous perspectives, is it's got limited functions in terms of how it investigates people. So it doesn't investigate police officers, and it certainly doesn't investigate the Crime Commission. two areas that are priorities for First Nations given our over-incarceration and our deaths in custody. So I would like to see something that speaks to First Nation interests on that.
Ken Henry, do you see any justification for us not yet being able to see what the government's plans are specifically for a National Integrity Commission?
No, honestly, I don't get it.
The Prime Minister says he didn't want to spare a single public servant during this crisis.
Well, if that's true, then the public service has been run down even more than I had imagined the public service has been run down. Honestly, when I was in government, the public service certainly would have been capable of producing the legislation and indeed establishing such a commission whilst dealing with multiple crises. If it really is the case that the public service is incapable of doing that right now because we have to manage COVID-19, then the public service is in a very bad shape. And that's a tragedy for the country.
But if we're being blunt about it, that line that it couldn't be done during COVID, what was your reaction?
Oh, well, my first reaction was, I hope we don't have another bushfire season. That was my first reaction. I mean, honestly, this can't be right.
The public sees, they must see through it. They can't believe it. I mean, I don't think that politicians, and I agree with Dave Sharma that, you know, people who go in typically do want to do the right thing, but I just don't think they respect the community. If you can have a Prime Minister who stands up and says, we can't cope with a promise we made, what was it, 2 or 3 years ago, because we're dealing with COVID-19, 3 years ago. I just don't, the public just doesn't believe that.
It's so
Hamish, can I just say, I mean, we're committed to doing this.
What's infuriating, though, is when we're talking about putting the people first, and, you know, you raised the point with, I hope a New South Wales bushfire doesn't happen again. When I see the Prime Minister taking a holiday to Hawaii in the midst of bushfire seasons and people are losing lives, people are losing their property, small businesses, you know, all their investment that they've put into that, they're losing. You know, it's inappropriate behaviour and it's insensitive to what everyday Australians are going through right now. You know, we're in the midst of a recession and we've come out of the bushfire season, but then we've gone into a global pandemic. And I think what the everyday Australian is feeling is, you know, this feeling of frustration because it's so insensitive and it's flippant expenditure of taxpayers' dollars that we're all having to put up with.
I should say, Hamish, I certainly accept what Dave's saying, that it will happen. There's no doubt in my mind that it will happen. The question in my mind is whether the government understands why it should have higher priority. There's a hell of a lot at stake here. I mean, you know, you started this conversation, or Alan started this conversation, talking about the loss of trust in politicians. And we've spent years observing the consequences of a loss of trust in business, one after another, one sector after another, after another, after another. We're setting up a Royal Commission, roughly one a year. It tells us there's a systemic issue here, surely. We know that there's been a loss of trust in media, excluding the ABC, of course, right? But there has been a loss of trust in media. There's even been a substantial loss of trust in NGOs, non-government organisations. We've seen horrific stories that have caused a loss of trust. But if you think of the various institutions of our system of democracy and our economic system, politicians are the most important. And the reason they are the most important is because it's the politicians who are meant to make sure that the system works for us. That's why it's so important. And if we lose faith in our politicians, then we're going to have a different system. Okay. And in fact, we are taking matters into our own hands, aren't we? I mean, you look at the way that social media is used these days. What's that saying? A lot of it's saying we've given up on politics. We're taking matters into our own hands.
This is precisely what the Uluru Statement from the Heart was. It's a people's movement, and it wasn't presented actually to politicians. What it was presented to was the Australian public, and it was gifted to the Australian public, you know, as a call for walk with us. This is a grassroots people movement. We don't want politicians deciding this fate. We want a referendum and we want all Australians to walk with us and decide how we're going to transform this system so it actually works for everyone.
All right. On that note, you're watching Q&A. If you want to join the conversation on social media, the hashtag is Quanda, and we do ask that you do join the debate respectfully if you're joining from home. Our next question is from Caroline Egan.
Aged care workers have to get by on an income of around $50,000 and many earn much less. They have insecure roles and often no paid annual leave. They don't get superannuation or sick pay, let alone severance pay, long service leave and the like. The recent revelations from Australia Post and ASIC about Cartier watch bonuses and $120,000 tax minimisation bills highlight the vast chasm between the different types of workers in Australia. My question is, how much of these exorbitant income executives earn in salaries and bonuses is deserved, and how much is simply greed or the most they can get away with?
Dani?
I mean, I would love a Cartier watch. Still waiting for my Cartier watch. I mean...
But is it greed? Is that what this is about, or something else?
It is. I mean, and it's insensitive. As I say, I'll say it again. I mean, people in this, in the global pandemic and in, the midst of a recession, they have lost lives. They have lost a lot of money. They have lost their jobs, and we've got Christmas around the corner and they're trying to figure out the best way in which they're going to manage their finances. And what we see here with that kind of expenditure is absolute greed and, it's distrust. You're dealing with public funds, and look at the extravagant gifts that are being, flippantly, put out there and gifted. So,
Ken Henry, why do you think there is so much outrage about these watches? The sum total of which I think was $20,000 or so.
Yeah.
And yet the comparative outrage around the purchase of land near the Badgerys Creek Airport, $30 million the Commonwealth spent of taxpayers' money on land that was worth $3 million.
Yeah.
Can you explain why the public reacts to one with so much more outrage than the other?
Well, I think it's in the question. I think it's in the question. People understand the circumstances in which they live. They understand how they're treated as an employee, and they simply cannot understand how somebody in a different place with a different title can be treated in a completely different way, right? It's the juxtaposition of those two things that they find really difficult to understand. Actually, it's impossible to understand, I think. But I would say that, and I would encourage people, because that question really has two parts. I would encourage people to focus on the first part, which is, why the hell are people in aged care paid so badly? That's the real question here, I think. A few Cartier watches, of course, it's kind of salacious and it's, it kind of makes for good media. But the really important question here is why we pay aged care workers so badly. That's the important question.
Yeah, I think that's...
I just want to bring in Dave Sharma, though, on the Cartier watches. We all saw the visceral reaction from the Prime Minister and your government to the news about these watches, and we can compare that to the response around the Leppington Triangle property purchase, the Sports Rorts affair. There's obviously a range of other incidents that have occurred. Why did that provoke such a reaction from your government while these other incidents didn't?
Well, I'd say, Hamish, I think it offended the Cartier watches issue. It offended everyone's sensibilities and sense of solidarity through this crisis, and particularly since it's a public corporation, it's taxpayer owned, and or we're the largest shareholder anyway. And people thought, it was absolutely the wrong signal to be sending at a time when a lot of people are going through a lot of difficult times. I distinguish it here, though. I mean, that was clearly a decision taken by the leadership of Australia Post to do this. The Leppington Triangle issue, I mean, that was not a decision that came to a minister. The Australian National Audit Office has made adverse findings. It's being investigated and the AFP is investigating. So let's find a culprit before we point the finger in that instance.
But what about ministerial responsibility for things like that?
Well, I don't think there's any suggestion that the minister responsible took that decision. It was taken by bureaucrats within the department. The minister's responsibility is to get to the bottom of it.
That is not how ministerial responsibility works in our system of government.
Well, it is how it works today.
It's not how it's supposed to work.
According to you, Simon, yes.
No, the convention... No, not according to me. The well-understood conventions of ministerial responsibility is that the only way that you can hold the executive who exercises power to account is by a minister being accountable to the parliament who represent the people. Yeah. And it requires a very difficult fiction to be put in place, which is that ministers take responsibility even if they may not personally have directed a certain action or known of it. Because if they don't, then there's no way our system works, Dave. And
But
if
Simon,
you
an
volunteer
investigation into this is still
to be a
ongoing.
minister,
An investigation into this is still ongoing, and you're already assuming what the findings are.
No, I'm challenging your claim that
that's contrary to due process.
No, I'm challenging your claim,
It is.
Dave, that ministerial responsibility doesn't apply in the way that I said it does. Now, I'm happy for due process, but ultimately the minister is responsible.
We haven't looked at the findings there yet.
When I joined the public service, the doctrine of ministerial responsibility was in place. Now, this is 1984, it's a hell of a long time ago, but the doctrine of ministerial responsibility was in place. And what it meant was that if there was significant maladministration in a department or agency that was within the portfolio of the minister, or there was a really bad policy and the policy went shonky, the minister stood down. That was what the doctrine of ministerial responsibility meant. And it disappeared, I would say, at some stage in the Howard government years, just disappeared. These days, I'm not sure. I'd actually be interested in Tanya and Dave's view on this, but is it even the case today that if a minister misleads the House, that the minister feels obliged to correct the record as soon as is humanly possible, else the minister has to resign?
Tanya?
Well, I think it really depends on the minister, doesn't it? We've had examples in recent times. We're talking about the Leppington Triangle of land now, but we've had sports rorts, we've had water buyback rorts, we've had the grassland scandal, we've had travel rorts, we've had alleged branch stacking with taxpayer funds, we've had a bunch of things. We had Angus Taylor saying that the document that he relied on to make claims about the City of Sydney Council was not forged. He said that in the Parliament more than once. And then, I mean, where did it come from? Seriously, it beggars belief that he was telling the truth in the Parliament when he said that. So obviously there are some ministers who don't feel that misleading the Parliament is a sacking offence. And what's really terrible about this is that the Prime Minister should be upholding these standards. He should be insisting that these standards are upheld, and he doesn't. He puts some people on the backbench for a spell, like Stuart Robert or Susan Ley, when they get in trouble, and then they just get recycled in the next ministerial reshuffle. The standards have been declining for years. That's why we need a National Integrity Commission.
All right, let's take our next question. It's from Deanna McMahon. The next question from Deanna McMahon.
Thanks, Hamish. There are slip-ups and mistakes from both Liberal and Labor leaders. The latest is Gladys Berejiklian in New South Wales. What would it take for leaders from both sides to realise they are all just living in glass houses? Should we expect any better from our pollies, or just shrug our shoulders and say they're only human?
Simon Longstaff, Dan Andrews, Gladys Berejiklian, are they just human?
Of course, they are subject to human frailty, and I think they do an incredibly difficult job, but it's a job they volunteered to do. No one is forced to seek elected office. No one is required to become a minister. And if you do, it comes with consequences, some of which are that there are things which are obviously unfair, like being responsible for things that you didn't directly do yourself, but which are an essential ingredient of the public service you give. It's not fair for a soldier who volunteers to go to war, to hazard their life, but they do it. It comes with the task. And so it does with people who are ministers. So you bring your human frailty to bear, but then you have to have the kind of moral courage to accept what comes with the position. And if you make a mistake, to be open about it and not try and paper over it to the point that people think to be absurd. So I think there's a huge challenge for there, and we need to understand, yes, of course, I'd hate to be in that role. I'm sure I'd do a terrible job at it. But I just want to believe of myself that if I did get into a position where that kind of error was there, I would honour those conventions, not for my own sake, but for the sake of the public that I claim to serve.
But Simon, just to be clear, do you think it's reasonable for the public to be asking whether these two leaders should continue to serve in their roles, given what's happened in both New South Wales and Victoria? I
think they're different cases. I think certainly in the case of New South Wales, which I know a bit more about because I've watched it more closely, in the case of the Premier, there's a ministerial code of conduct, and there's some question about whether or not conflicts were disclosed.
But to be clear, there's no specific allegation against.
No, not of that. Not around any notion of corruption, but there is a question about whether or not conflicts of interest were disclosed as required under the Ministerial Code of Conduct. And unfortunately, it's become a highly partisan matter within the Legislative Assembly. I mean, what I think ought to have happened is that the Premier, if in any doubt about this at all, should have referred the matter to a disinterested umpire in the form of the ICAC, because this Code of Conduct is part of that legislation, and let them form a view based on the facts.
If we accept the argument, Ken and Simon, that you just put about ministerial responsibility, why is it, for example, that in Victoria, Dan Andrews, although saying he accepts responsibility for what's happened, hasn't...
Oh no, ultimately, I think he should be just as responsible in the way I've said about it. I'm not trying to say that there's one rule for him and a different. We've got to be even-handed in our expectations, irrespective of what we think about the particular merits of that individual as a person, and you can admire them as individuals, but that doctrine applies irrespective of party.
Tanya,
and it is, yeah, well, Dan Andrews faces the media every day and does a long press conference. He's instituted an inquiry into the hotel quarantine. He started that inquiry into his own government. The health minister's resigned, the head of the public service has resigned down there for some of the shortcomings of their system. In contrast, in New South Wales, there doesn't seem to have been much action yet,
but can
or
you
many
explain, Tanya
consequences.
Plibersek, why the head of the public service had to go, the health minister had to go, but not the Premier, given what you've just described?
I mean, maybe Simon wants to jump in here as well, but we're talking about the doctrine of ministerial responsibility, and the minister who was responsible for some of the shortcomings took ministerial responsibility and went, and the head of the public service went.
We still don't know who signed off on this decision about the private security in the hotels in Melbourne. That did lead ultimately to hundreds of people dying in Victoria. I'm just wondering where the ministerial responsibility kicks in at the level of Premier.
Yeah, well, that's a rather difficult question to answer, given that we don't have all the facts. And I know and I understand why people want to rush to judgment, but, you know, I think we should be careful not to try people before we have all the facts. And I'd also remind people that, you know, right at the start, and Dave said something which I absolutely agree with, that actually through this crisis, our politicians have been doing a good job. And I think that's true of all of the premiers, and I think it's true of the Prime Minister as well. And I think it demonstrates
So should they be given some more leeway on some of these things?
I think we do have to give them more leeway. But of course, why don't we give them more leeway? It's because they keep disappointing us. You know, that's why we don't give them more leeway. We expect a hell of a lot more of them than they normally deliver. They've demonstrated an ability to run the system well, okay, in some places much better than in others, but generally to run the system well in a crisis. We want them, don't we, to be able to run the system well all of the time, right? That's their responsibility. They shouldn't be surprised that we're hard on them. And by the way, and in the question, Dani, I think it's the question started with something about politicians understanding they live in a glass house. They really should understand that they live in a glass house. And before they do anything, they should ask themselves the question, who's watching? And the answer to that question should be, probably everybody. Maybe not today, but they will find out. And that might encourage a higher level of behaviour, a heightening of ethical standards.
Dani, should a different standard be applied to Gladys Berejiklian because she has delivered during the COVID crisis, do you think?
Look, I think, again, like, I'd have to agree with Ken and Simon. Like, it's a contextual issue. I mean, I do intuitively empathise with everything that Dan Andrews gone through, but it's because look at the situation in Victoria compared to New South Wales. Like, you can't really compare the two. And for a person that's willing to stand in front of the media and be held accountable and answer questions every single day. If you would have said this to him when he was first elected, one day you're going to become Premier and you're going to go through one of the most trying, hardest global crisis of your time, and you're going to have to stand and be held accountable and publicly scrutinised by the media and by the public every day for every decision that you make in trying to protect people's lives and during, lockdown, I don't think he probably would have said yes to that. And so I think, given the circumstances, the fact that he's still standing around and he's made it clear to the public, I'm not walking away from this. I'm going to let the right processes play out and I'll see what the decision's made after that. But I'm going to be held accountable either way. And he's still turning up every day to answer questions, speaks volumes. So I think you can't really compare the two.
All right. The next question is a video from Tabitha Senior in Blacktown, New South Wales.
Hi there. I'm a born and bred Queenslander, and for the past several years, for work purposes, I have resided in New South Wales. Before the pandemic hit, I would travel home about 4 to 5 times per year to see my loved ones, to see those who meant something to me, my friends, my family, my social network, and obviously my support network. Since the pandemic has hit, like many Australians, I have been subjected to the border closures and restrictions, which have isolated me from those that I care about. Other Australians are isolated from their partners, their families, their children, their parents, so on and so forth. My question is it ethical for the Australian state leaders to turn a blind eye to the ongoing mental health conditions and issues that many Australians are now going to be facing due to these restrictions?
Dave Sharma.
Well, it's a good question from Tabitha, and it highlights, I think, a lot of the personal hardship that people are facing. And look, absolutely, no, it's not ethical to turn a blind eye to these things. These state borders have imposed, immense, personal and psychological and other difficulties on people, as have, like, the lockdowns in Victoria. And I think they could only be justified when there's strong and compelling health evidence that that was the right thing to do. Now, that's inevitably, you're weighing against people's freedoms against their health and trying to protect their health at the expense of some of their freedoms. And we've had to do this through this pandemic. We've had to, close international borders. We've had to introduce, social distancing. We've had to make a number of businesses unviable because of the health risks of the pandemic. But we need to be very careful with every one of those decisions we take to restrict people's liberty or their ability to earn a living or to see their family, that there's a pretty strong justification for doing so.
Why is it that the federal government has been tougher on some states more than others around border closures? It's been pretty notable the way the government has gone after the federal government has gone after the Queensland government, a Labor state, but hasn't had all that much to say about South Australia and Tasmania also imposing border restrictions.
Well, I think for South Australia and Tasmania, I mean, look, I don't agree that there's been a different approach. I'd say that this is... I don't. I mean, this was discussed at the National Cabinet. There was meant to be a 3-phase approach and the states were moving at their own pace.
Could you name one of your federal colleagues that's been sort of taking pot shots at the South Australian or Tasmanian premiers in the media the way they have it done at Anastasia Palaszczuk in Queensland?
I think there's a unique set of circumstances on the New South Wales-Queensland border. It's been the New South Wales Premier as much as anyone that's been taking shots at the Queensland Premier because of the unique hardships that were imposed on a pretty significant border community there across those borders. We've seen the same thing on the Victorian South Australia border and the Victorian New South Wales border.
So there has been a different approach?
I think you need to look at the risk. I mean, South Australia was closing its borders by and large to Victoria because of the risk coming from Victoria. The New South Wales-Victoria border closure, I don't think people objected to because people understood that the risk emanating from Victoria was high. But I think the Queensland-New South Wales border, I don't think there was much health evidence to justify that closure, or at least not for the duration it has been in place for.
Tanya Plibersek, the question was whether it's ethical for state leaders to do what they've done.
I think it's definitely been hard on people. Obviously, Tabitha's right in saying that there have been significant mental health impacts on people who are separated from loved ones, people who haven't been able to travel for work, for a whole range of reasons. And we can't ignore that. I think it's important that the government has expanded the number of counselling sessions, for example, that are available through Medicare. That's a good thing that the federal government's done. But I think I do think that a lot of these restrictions have been necessary, and you only need to look at what's happening with the second wave or a third wave of infections in Europe at the moment, the extraordinarily high infection rates in the United States, to see what would have happened or could have happened in Australia if the virus had got out of control. So it has been hard, but I think it's been...
When you saw the Queensland government preventing people coming into Queensland on compassionate grounds for funerals, to see dying relatives, and then letting in footy players and celebrities to shoot films. Didn't you look at that and think, that doesn't seem very fair?
Yeah, I think when you look at some of the decisions that are being made, you know, day by day, you'd scratch your head sometimes and say, oh, I'm not sure why that decision was made and not that decision. But this is completely uncharted territory for any of us. It's all new. It's all happening for the first time.
So sometimes ethics go by the wayside?
No, I think what
No, it's not that ethics go by the wayside. That's not what I'm saying, Hamish. These are systems run by human beings, and human beings are fallible, and we try and learn from our mistakes and do better next time. So none of this has been perfect. And what troubles me is that we've got a federal government pointing the finger, as you say, in different ways at different states, and also refusing to take responsibility for the things that are federal responsibilities, like aged care, completely a federal responsibility. Look at the terrible number of deaths in aged care in Victoria. Like the app that was supposed to help with contact tracing, we found out today it's found a total of 17 people for a $70 million spend. Like getting Australians home from overseas, we've still got about 30,000 Australians stuck overseas. So instead of just pointing the finger at the states that they don't like, how about the federal government takes responsibility for the things that are a federal responsibility and gets them right?
I think when it comes to these really difficult issues, you're always best served to go back to basic principles. So here are three things I think you could do. One, that you should only restrict people's liberties when it's strictly necessary to do so, and only to the extent that's necessary. Secondly, that when it comes to privileging life over other considerations, you should do so on that basis. And in that sense, you have to recognise that at the moment, in the absence of a vaccine, the best information, and Dave Sharma's right, we should always look at the actual medical evidence and make an informed decision on that basis. But in some cases where there are hot spots and other things that need to be managed, the only tool we have available to us at the moment is some form of isolation. Whereas the other kind of harms that Tabitha spoke of, we've got many other things we could do. If we wanted to, we could make a massive investment in helping people with their mental health. That's a choice we can make, as we can make a massive investment in other things. But we don't have any other tool to preserve lives for those aged and vulnerable people where the medical case required. And so that's how I would try and do it. I'd say to our politicians, go at the principles, enlarge liberty, go base it on evidence, and then use what tools you've got to offset the other mischief that you're causing that Tabitha spoke of.
Often the predominant feature of our decision-making comes down to cost and the benefit to our economy. If you just sort of zoom out from this question and the broader conversation we're having tonight, you've done a big piece of work at the Ethics Centre around, I suppose, the cost of a more ethical Australia. Do you think we would be better off economically if we made more ethical choices as a community?
Well, I wouldn't want to ground the case for ethics on economics, but what we did do, and I had a degree of reluctance when we did it, we asked Deloitte Access Economics a simple question: what, if any, is the effect of ethics on the economy? And it's not the cost, the extraordinary thing, complete surprise to everybody, I think, who was involved, that you don't have to go for perfection. And we've been struggling with this here, you know, the human failings and all the rest. If you just had a 10% improvement in the ethics of this country, it would deliver a $45 billion increase in GDP. And this is incredibly rigorous economic analysis that's been done. 75 different data sets they've used, 3 forms of economic modelling. It'll increase the wealth of individual Australians. It will reduce mental health stress by 1%. In other words, it'll improve it by 1%. No matter which way you look at it, if you wanted to have a better kind of recovery coming out of COVID, the one thing you would invest in is the ethical infrastructure that we've been touching on, you know, and it just gives extraordinary... I mean, you've seen...
What's ethical infrastructure, like an integrity commission?
Oh, no, it's the integrity commission. We've touched on it tonight. The Auditor General, who I think had their funds cut in the last budget. The role that the media plays, the role of the professions, politicians and political parties. If we could have a solid ethical foundation, which... And I'd go with Dani on this. I'd be looking at Indigenous insight to find something that truly belongs to us. No one else can say it. Yeah. I'd say, what would that tell us that we could use as an informed basis? And Ken, you've seen the figures, I think. You know, just how extraordinary it is.
Well, yeah, and I don't find the figures at all surprising.
Don't you?
No, I don't find the figures surprising because the ethical investment that is talked about in the report is substituting for something that is badly lacking. That is, in the lack of trust in our institutions is a huge drag on our economy.
Yeah.
How can a system is not going to work if people don't trust the system, right? Or at least it's going to work imperfectly. It's not going to work as well as it could work if the system is not trusted. And really what the report is saying is, if we can improve trust in the system by making an investment in ethics, an investment in ethical behaviour, then we get an economic dividend. It makes perfectly good sense.
Okay. Let's take our next question. It's a video from Patricia Farrer in Concord, New South Wales.
This week I was shocked and appalled to see footage of Scott Morrison behaving disrespectfully towards Tanya Plibersek when she was addressing Parliament. Morrison turned his back on her and played with his phone, as did Josh Frydenberg. I first noticed Morrison's behaviour when Anthony Albanese was delivering his budget reply. Is this a new standard of parliamentary behaviour? Should we ignore it or call it out for what it is, rudeness and disrespect?
Well, if you missed the image, this is it. It was taken by Alex Ellinghausen, one of the brilliant press gallery photographers. That image went viral. Tanya Plibersek, how do you respond?
Well, I can tell you how my mum responded. She said, "Your posture's terrible in that photo. Stand up straight next time." Honestly, it doesn't bother me. It doesn't bother me how they treat me. What bothers me is the disrespect shown to our democracy when people behave badly in our parliament, and the fact that then ordinary Australians look at it and feel alienated from it. They say democracy's not important, it's not for me, they're all the same, they all behave badly. And really, I do sometimes feel like we're in a kind of existential fight for the soul of democracy. There's this organisation called Freedom House, and it says that we're in the 14th year of democratic decline globally. So it's an institution set up in 1941 by Eleanor Roosevelt and others. We are going backwards in the number of countries that have properly functioning democracies globally. We need to fight for and protect and defend our democracy here in Australia, and the very notion of democracy, that all of us have a say, that everybody's say matters. And I think, you know, like, I don't care what they think about me, I don't care what they say about me, I've got pretty tough skin.
Tanya, I
do care about democracy.
I'm sure you know it would have taken us about 5 minutes to dig up photos of what happens when the government's talking in Parliament. You can take a look at this one. Now, I mean, this question was about standards in Parliament. And the point is, we all watch Parliament and we all see, I'm sure you can see yourself there in that image, looking down at your phone. This is not just about one side of politics, is it? This is about the diminishing standards of our parliamentary democracy, of which all of you in our Parliament are part.
Yeah. Sometimes I've got to say the phone is actually people tweeting during question time because we're not allowed to shout out anymore, so we get on the
But come on, you shouldn't be on Twitter, should you, during question time? Aren't you there to represent us?
I think that's... Actually, I think it's a really good time to engage with people. It takes you a second to say, hang on a minute, what that minister said is not true. This is the reason it's not true. There are people who are following question time from home, and it's communicating with them directly during question time to say, hang on a minute, think twice about what you've just been told.
So
I think that's actually quite a good part of democracy, to be able to communicate directly with people in real time instead of going out after question time, ringing up a journalist saying, oh, I really want you to follow this story, you know, and putting yourself at the mercy of a journalist. Oh, I think that's okay, as long as it's within reason, quickly, and then you're done, as long as there's a reason like that. But I am, you know, I am at a deeper sense worried about the notion that it doesn't matter, that democracy doesn't matter anymore because they're all the same. And that's, I think, at the heart of what your questioner was getting to, that decline in standards, giving people a a feeling that nothing they do makes a difference, nothing they say or believe gets through to us, and that's really dangerous.
Dani, what do you see when you see all of these politicians on the different sides of the benches looking down at their phones instead of engaging in the actual parliamentary process?
I mean, it speaks volumes. I look at different things that go on in politics, and I look at our Indigenous representatives, and when there's something going on, whether it's out the front of Parliament House or a particular Indigenous issue that they're talking to, and the total lack of consideration or interest in actually engaging and learning something from those issues. And like I said before, having, a vested interest in having a bit of a political debate and contesting ideas about the best way forward of overcoming those types of issues. But from another thing, when I look at a photo with Tanya and, Scott Morrison turning his back on her, the kind of message that sends for, what's meant to be representative but, also inclusive of all people, the kind of message it sends for the casual onlooker is that it's not. And so what I really think is it's about time we have more diversity within our parliament, and maybe that in and of itself would work as a bit of a accountability measure, because you're going to have different kinds of political opinions based on different cultural experiences and identities, making better informed decisions. And that's a really good thing we have. If we look abroad to New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern has an overwhelming majority government, and her government at the moment is the most diversified New Zealand's ever seen. And, people absolutely adore her and her leadership there, and she gets great outcomes for her people, and there's trust there. These are the types of things that we should be looking onto from an Australian perspective and thinking, what can we learn from that? How do we create that kind of democratic inclusivity within our institution?
Can I just ask Dave and Tanya, when the cameras aren't on, because that might have just been an unfortunate time, when we're not watching, do you all actually get on? And is it much more the kind of thing that we want our democracy to be, that you're cooperating in committee meetings and things like that?
Dave Sharma?
Look, that's absolutely been my experience. I've been surprised. I'm new to Parliament. I've only been here a little over a year. But when question time isn't on, when the cameras aren't rolling, it's quite a collegial, friendly and courteous workplace. That might sound strange, but I think everyone in the building has a respect for one another and, what they bring to the table. And look, I agree, question time and some of the features of it are an unfortunate, representation to the public. It's an adversarial chamber, though. It's an adversarial format.
Do you tweet during question time, Dave?
No, I rarely tweet. I don't think I would. I may have occasionally tweeted during question time, but I wouldn't normally. But I'd say, look, often I'll be speaking in the Parliament and people will be interjecting or yelling at me or putting me off my game, but I don't take it as a sign of disrespect from those opposite. It's just how it is. It's and I'd encourage your viewers, I think to perhaps be a little more generous in their estimation of their politicians and don't just judge about what they see from question time.
But I think this is the important point, though, isn't it, Dave? I certainly accept what you're saying, and of course I have seen it behind the scenes as well, and I have observed politicians across the chamber getting on very, very well privately. But what's at issue here is that when they demonstrate something different in public, and I accept that it's an adversarial chamber, but when they demonstrate something different in public, people lose trust in democracy. And there's a hell of a lot at stake here. And, I said earlier that our system, and I mean our system generally, doesn't work if people don't trust democracy. Just if you'll indulge me just 1 minute.
Quickly,
there was a lot of discussion some years ago when in the height of the Royal Commission into Banking and Finance about the social responsibility of business, and a lot of people were quoting Milton Friedman and the point that he made that business has no social responsibility beyond profit. But if you read Capitalism and Freedom, his text, which I first read the 20th edition of in 1982, and he released the 40th edition in 2002. He kept going back and revising it because it's so difficult. But he makes it abundantly clear that without a functioning democracy, capitalism lacks legitimacy. And why? Because he says that you need a functioning democracy in order to ensure that if businesses have no social responsibility beyond profit, that we, the rest of us, are not ripped off by businesses exercising monopoly power. We're not ripped off by businesses defrauding us. We're not ripped off by businesses deceiving us. And we're not adversely affected by all of the negative externalities, like, for example, human-induced climate change, that business create.
All right.
That's a responsibility of government,
That leads us to our next question. It's a video from Peter Branson in Batemans Bay, New South Wales.
Ken Henry said it would take 10 years to bring about cultural change at NAB, just before he's shown the door. Ken, my question is, do you think staff with ill intent will quickly begin behaving ethically in their clients' interests if they saw that a few of their straying colleagues were being jailed?
And we should make it clear that Peter, who asked that question, does have a long-standing complaint with the NAB. He's mounted a campaign against predatory lending, particularly by NAB. But Ken Henry, that question was about whether jailing bankers would send a stronger message.
It would certainly send a message. It would terrify a lot of people, and I don't know whether it would give people more confidence in the banking system.
You
honestly.
laughed at that. Why?
And I'll tell you why. Because look at what has happened. The banking system has been subject to, appropriately, by the way, intense scrutiny by a Royal Commission. I think the most expensive Royal Commission in Australia's history in terms of taxpayers' dollars spent. I think so. In addition, subject to extraordinary media scrutiny, all of which was entirely justified as far from my perspective. Then by the government providing additional resources to the judicial system and giving ASIC an additional $400 million to track down people who had been shown to be guilty of some offence. And now, if all of that has led to nobody going to jail, then should we assume that what's really at issue here is not that bankers... Well, look, some bankers may well have broken the law. They certainly acted, many of them, unethically. Question here is, I think, with respect to the question, whether people wouldn't trust the banking system more if bankers acted more ethically.
So a lot of people reacted when we said you were coming on this program tonight to talk about ethics, given your experience at the Royal Commission. Some time's passed now. Obviously, there was a big public reaction to your appearance at the Royal Commission. Has that experience changed what you think about ethics in public life?
Oh, yes, in one very important respect. We should be more open in talking about it. We should. We should be, when we are challenged, we should be more open. And we should spend more time as leaders talking to the people for whom we are responsible about the importance of ethics. And we should not assume that when issues are brought to our attention, there's just a few rotten apples. We should not assume that everybody who works for us has a good sense of what is the right thing to do in the often challenging circumstances that confront them, where they have to make trade-offs. Rather, we should assume that they need support, and in particular, they need support in deciding what is right and what is wrong.
You've also got to understand too what ethics requires of us. And this is true of everybody, whether you're like me running an ethics centre or politicians or any of us here. It's not that it's about just complying with a set of rules and codes. The really dangerous thing that undermines ethics in any organisation or society are two things. Firstly, hypocrisy, where you say one thing and you do something else. And the cause of that, more often than not, is not that people wake up in the morning intending to be hypocrites, but you ask them, why did you do what you did? And they say almost without fail, but everybody was doing it. Or that's just the way it's done around here.
Yep.
what ethics is really about. It's that quiet, insistent voice that challenges the unthinking custom and practice. It'll be in Parliament. There'll be stuff done that no one can really explain. Oh, it's just the way we do it, and it has these unintended effects, and so on and so forth.
I just want to come back to you though, Ken, because I think you obviously have reflected a lot on what happened at the Banking Royal Commission. And I suppose we're all here to kind of take some lessons from the wisdom that you all bring to this panel. And I just want to know whether, when you saw the reaction, did you know straight away, I buggered that up? I was too defensive.
Absolutely.
I did come across as
sort of
disrespectful.
Well, I was surprised when people said I was disrespectful, but I accept it. Of course I accept it. I wasn't intending to be disrespectful. On reflection, I was intending to be defensive, and that is, of course, ridiculous. You know, I think I can rationalise it, but it's no excuse. My rationalisation is that I felt like I was in the dock. So maybe it's kind of understandable one in the dock might feel the need to defend oneself. But really that was not the occasion for the way that I handled the questions. I should have been much more open. I should have actually said what I believed, right? Which is that we've stuffed up a lot of things and we need to fix them.
And do you think leaders would be more ethical if they were more willing to do that more often?
Not only would leaders be more ethical, I think the organisations they run would be more ethical. Sure, I do.
Yeah.
Let's take our next question. It's from Niall O'Brien.
Thanks, Hamish. With its rich history and unparalleled connection to this land, is Australia missing out on a huge opportunity to have an Indigenous bipartisan voice to Parliament at the top level to ensure ethical decisions are being made to help protect this land, the environment and its peoples?
Dani.
100%. Okay, like I said before, the Uluru Statement from the Heart was a gift to the Australian people for everyone to walk together as one. It was a people's movement, and it was a calling for democratic action and actually listening to First Nations. And, you know, the government taking action on this really important constitutional reform proposal that's being proposed, and that's a voice to Parliament, a constitutionally entrenched voice to Parliament. Now, this started over 10 years ago, and we've had a heap of reports, we've had a heap of consultation that's been had from community. We're now in the co-design process, and that's coming towards the end, and we'll have an interim report that gets put to the government, and the government will then look at the different options, design options of how the voice would function, and then another consultation process will be had. My issue with all of that is the people that were involved in the regional dialogues and the Uluru Convention, the First Nations, the Cultural Authority, the peoples who have put blood, sweat and tears to, you know, coming up with this type of meaningful, substantive, structural reform for First Nations to finally have a voice to Parliament, to have a say on laws and policies that impact upon First Nation affairs for the first time, and really important given our history. We're still waiting for action, and I want to see the elders and the Cultural Authority that participated in the dialogues actually see this come to a referendum, see some sort of, you know, positive resolution and outcome finally be reached by the government. And so I think it's really down to, and maybe Dave Sharma can shed some light on this, because there's lacked transparency in the co-design process. It's not been, you know, it hasn't involved First Nations who were involved in the regional dialogues in the Uluru Convention. It's been quite clouded in secrecy, and that's been an issue. So I really don't know where things are at with where we're moving forward from here.
Dave Sharma, what does it say that someone like Dani, who has been involved in this process quite substantially, now doesn't know where it's at?
I think it's unfortunate. I mean, someone like Dani's got a real contribution to make to this process, as do, you know, many Indigenous Australians, and with the consultation process with developing the voice. There's a commission being led by Tom Calmer and Marsha Langton, I believe, that are meant to be going out and consulting with communities across Australia, Indigenous communities, Indigenous leaders, Indigenous elders across Australia, to help develop a voice that reflects, you know, the aspirations of those people consulted and creates a workable vehicle for this to happen. So, look, we do need to get this consultation process right. It needs to have a wide degree of buy-in and legitimacy for it to happen. So, you know, I'd be happy to, you know, catch up with Dani offline afterwards and see if we can fix up some of this.
Can you clarify for all of us whether a referendum is going to happen?
Well, we're committed to, the government's commitment is to developing the voice and then constitutional recognition. So constitutional recognition obviously does involve a referendum, but I think it's important that we make sure that any question we put to a referendum has a strong chance of success. I think with the, you know, success rate on referendums is about 8 out of the last 44 have been successful. So we want to make sure that what we put forward has broad public buy-in, broad state buy-in, broad Indigenous buy-in, and has a high chance of passing.
So probably not in this term of Parliament?
I think it's unlikely in this term of Parliament, yes.
Ken Henry, you do work in this area as well?
Well, yes. Well, I don't know how many in the audience will be aware. I'm on the board of Cape York Partnership, which is trying to create employment opportunities for Indigenous people in Cape York. Actually, we're doing better than trying, we are creating. And I used to be on the board of Reconciliation Australia was for some time. And look, I can't tell you how gutted I was when I saw Prime Minister Turnbull's response to the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Actually, I was beyond gutted. I was just so angry. Can't tell you how angry I was. I've been stunned really at that there's been that Indigenous people have not reacted with greater anger.
So Dani said twice tonight.
Can we just let Dani respond to that?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but it's a cop-out. I mean, I do find that remark to be quite frustrating because I'm there. I'm protesting, you know, in Black Lives Matter movements, and I'm there advocating relentlessly, and so are many other First Nations and non-Indigenous Australians across this country, frustrated and wanting this to be finally dealt with, wanting to come together and wanting a referendum on this. We want to restore principles of representative democracy and actually let the people decide, put it to a referendum and let the people decide. And even though there's been failed referendums in the past, the one that actually got the most yes votes ever in Australian history was the 1967 referendum, and that was on Indigenous affairs. So we're fed up with it, and, you know, part of, you know, the issue with our structural issues within Australia is the fact that we have been forced to be really complacent with this kind of unethical decision-making and exclusion of our rights politically. Yeah. So it's about time.
There's a really important point, though, there's a really important point that Dani's made on 2 occasions now, which I think often gets missed in this. And she presented the Uluru Statement not as a demand from Indigenous people, but as a gift that was offered to everyone. Yeah. And I think Australians, when they come to have a referendum and all the rest, need to understand that this is not about giving something to Indigenous people. This is an offer for everybody to make us all better off as a nation. And the frustration and the anger that you often hear is from people who say, can't you understand what we're trying to give you? And you won't even spurn. And I think unless we understand the context of that simple truth, the debate will never be properly understood.
So is it not a deficit of anger amongst Indigenous Australians to how Malcolm Turnbull responded to the Uluru Statement, but rather a deficit of anger from the non-Indigenous population?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, yes, absolutely. I think so.
Tanya Plibersek.
I support a voice to Parliament, I support a treaty, and I support Makarrata, truth-telling. I think Australia will be a stronger, better nation when non-Indigenous Australians properly face the truth of our history. And I think what Dani's saying about this being a great gift, extending a hand, is a beautiful way of putting it. And it frustrates me no end that we know we're not further along the track we should be.
All right, we are over time. That's all we've got time for tonight. Would you please thank our awesome panel, Dani Larkin, Dave Sharma, Ken Henry, Tanya Plibersek and Simon Longstaff. Put your hands together. Thanks for all of your questions. As always, next week will be the eve of the US election. We'll debate what a Trump presidency or a Biden presidency would mean for us here in Australia. Fasten your seatbelts, folks. We'll see you then.